Hello and welcome to U.S. History. This is the lesson on triangular trade, and it's the beginning of Unit 1 where we talk about colonization. So it's important to see these terms here, triangular trade and mercantilism. Those are very important for this entire unit. So as we talk about what these things are, make sure that you're paying attention to that. So let's take a look at our timeline here. We're looking at pre-U.S. history, which is the time before colonization. So we're basically looking at anything pre-1607. I don't ask you to remember a lot of dates in this course, but you will need to remember at least these two, 1492 and 1607. So you might want to write that down if you're taking notes. 1492 is the year of Columbus's first voyage to what is now the Caribbean, or what you might call the West Indies. He was leaving west of Europe. So when he gets to the Caribbean islands, such as Cuba and Jamaica and the Bahamas, he sees those people and he thinks that he's in India. So he calls this the West Indies, and that's because he was going west in order to get there. And that's why even to this day people still refer to Native Americans as Indians, which is of course inaccurate. But looking at this particular thing here, in the 1450s, the African slave trade is begun by the Dutch. The Dutch are from a country called the Netherlands, where Amsterdam is the capital. You'll need to know that later. But they're the ones who begin this. And then we go through the 1500s, and then 1607, the first permanent British colony is founded at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Again, I'll say that over and over again because it's very important. That wasn't the first attempt. The first attempt was another place called Roanoke, which fell apart. And you may also need to know this, the oldest city in America is St. Augustine, Florida, and that was founded by the British. So don't get confused by that. This is the first permanent, successful colony by the British, and again it's Jamestown, and it's in Virginia. It's a very swampy area right along the James River, and slaves were brought even then. And then looking far ahead, in 1808, that's when Congress finally abolishes the transatlantic slave trade. So they're not bringing or importing any more slaves, but the slaves are still being traded that are in America. Slaves that are slaves remain slaves, and they are traded after that point, but you're not importing any more slaves after 1808. So why did colonists come to America? What was the purpose of them coming to America? Well, some wanted religious and political freedom, particularly in the colonial region known as New England. They were coming because they were politically oppressed and religiously oppressed back home in England, where you were a member of the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. You might remember back to world history where we talked about King Henry VIII and how he started his own church because he couldn't have a male heir, and it's a long story. He wanted a divorce, and he couldn't get one as a Catholic, so he started his own church. Well, you were supposed to be a member of that church, and if you weren't, you could be oppressed in or mistreated in England after that. So a lot of people came to America for freedom during that time. Mostly it was for the prospect of economic freedom, though. People wanted to come and they thought they might make a lot of money here. People would invest in bringing people here. They would pay their passage and hope that they would get a high return for that person's work. Or some of these groups that actually made the colonies, such as the Virginia Company, people would invest in that. It's called a joint stock company, and they would share the burden. That way, if it failed, one person didn't lose all of their money, just several people would lose a lot of money, but they wouldn't go under because of it. But it was for the prospect that people would come here to the Americas and find lots of gold and silver and that sort of thing. So they were trying to make money is the main reason that people invested in other folks coming to the colonies, and the people who came to the colonies thought they would become very wealthy. But England, through this process, wanted to extract or take away the resources from North America in order to compete with their other European rivals for example, France, which they had been in competition with for quite some time. So what they wanted to do was found these colonies and get the raw materials or the products from those colonies, bring them back to the mother country. That's the name of the country that births these other colonies, and they wanted to make money off of those colonies. So that was the primary idea for colonization. This is a system that we call mercantilism, and it's going to drive colonization. Again, there's that word mercantilism. It's an economic theory where what you want to do is reduce your imports and expand your exports, and that's going to create wealth. If you are importing something, that means you bought it. So as the stuff comes in, your money goes out. So you lose money on imports. When you buy from someone else, it just makes sense. You spend money, you lose money. Exports, you are selling something. So that thing is leaving your country and money is coming in. So you want low imports and high exports. Now, that is how you create wealth. And by the way, when you have that situation where you've got low imports and high exports, you have what's called a favorable balance of trade. That's important for you to know for economics. During the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, wealth is power. It's no longer based on how big your army is and all that. Granted, if you're a wealthy country, you're going to have a big army, but it's based on how much wealth you have. You get wealth created on the basis of your colonies, because remember, England is an island, so they don't have unlimited resources. So in order to get the things they need, they go and take over other areas that have the things they need, like lumber, and like fertile land where they can grow tobacco and cotton and things like that. So these things are called raw materials. Those raw materials are taken back to the mother country, and they are produced into other things in the factories that are there. This is called industrialization. Those are finished products. So think of it in terms of a shirt. Okay, a shirt is made from cotton. The cotton would be grown in the colonies. The cotton would be sent back to the mother country, England. England would take the cotton, make it into thread, make that into cloth, and make it into clothes. And then they would sell it back to the colonies as well and make a very hefty profit on it. And that was the idea behind mercantilism and the transatlantic trade. Some of these raw materials included lumber, sugar, tobacco, rice, and indigo. Indigo is something that you can dye things in. It's blue or purple. It's what we used to dye actually blue jeans in. So these raw materials were then used in England to produce manufactured goods or finished products or finished goods. You may see any of those terms there. But it's basically the completed product, the shirt, for example. And then they would take that, sell it to each other. They would sell it back to the colonies, or they would take it down to Africa, where they would trade those things for enslaved people and bring those people back to America in order to do the hard labor on the raw materials. So a favorable balance of trade is what results from England with their colonial arrangement. Raw materials are scarce in England because they're an island and were taken from the colonies to America. At the same time, colonies were also a place that could buy those finished products back that were made in Europe and also made from those raw materials. As a result, England did not like to allow their colonies to buy from other countries. If they buy from other countries, then they can get those things at cheaper prices. They might even find better quality, but it defeats the purpose of England even having a colony if they go and trade with somebody else. England wants to get that stuff very cheap so they can make it into other stuff. And that's the point of even having a colony. All right, so those are just a few examples of political cartoons on this subject. I'm going to move on through these so that we can get to the rest of the lecture. All right, looking at restrictions. So to maintain that favorable balance of trade, England implements these laws called navigation acts. Now that's going to pop up over and over again in the mid-1600s, and the whole point of the navigation acts is to maintain that favorable balance of trade. It's to make sure that the colonies only trade with England. That's the whole point. These laws are designed to keep the English colonies from competing with the mother country, England. And here's the three criteria of the navigation acts. You may see a few more in your reading, but these are the main ones. All goods from America had to travel on English ships. All imports, what they buy in the colonies, had to be processed through an English port. And third, most colonial resources could only be exported to England. So it was very specific that they could only trade with the mother country to make sure the mother country got all of the benefits of even having those colonies. Now, what are the negative effects of the Navigation Acts? Well, the Navigation Acts restricted profits for the colonists, and it made them angry. They could sell to other countries who would pay more than the British would pay. They made money off of that. They could buy from other countries and get things cheaper and better quality than what they were getting from England. And now they weren't allowed to do that, so it made them angry. So they're getting a lesser product and having to pay more for it. I'm sure that you can understand it would make you angry as well. It also forced them to pay higher prices for goods that they could get cheaper elsewhere, and it increased smuggling of illegal goods into North America by those who refused to follow those new rules. So it also caused quite a bit of what we call the black market. People are buying and selling under the table, smuggling stuff in, piracy and that sort of thing. The positive effects of the Navigation Act is that it brought this new shipbuilding industry to New England. So because they have to use British ships, they make British ships, and they have a lot of lumber there, particularly in the Pennsylvania region. So they're making these ships for the British, and that brings a lot of jobs. Since the acts required the use of English ships, that instantly provided demand for those ships and therefore jobs. Now, what is triangular trade? Also known as transatlantic trade, there's three terms that often get mixed up here, and it's the Columbian Exchange, transatlantic trade, and triangular trade. For our purposes, Columbian Exchange is this exchange of things that didn't exist in one part or the other from the New World or the Old World that came before Columbus's voyage in 1492. So, for example, there were not tomatoes in Europe before 1492, but because of what Columbus does in 1492, it begins a trade of those things. So there's no rhyme or reason to it except to understand that things came from the Old World, Europe, to the New World, what is the Americas and the Caribbean and that sort of thing, and vice versa, that didn't exist before. That's all the Columbian Exchange is. Move to your next class. Just kidding. Now, the triangular trade is exactly what it sounds like. It makes basically a triangle across the Atlantic, and that's what transatlantic means. Trans means across, Atlantic is the ocean. So it's a trade system that develops. So Columbian Exchange, again, is really simple. It's just stuff back and forth that didn't exist before. The triangular trade is what I'm about to explain to you now. So and again, it's two words for that. These are the same thing, triangular trade and transatlantic trade. Step one, English ships take rum, cloth, other manufactured goods to Africa where they're traded for the African slaves. Then in step two, the slaves are transported to the Americas and sold, and they work and they produce these very labor-intensive raw materials such as sugarcane and cotton and that sort of thing. And that passage that the slaves unfortunately have to come to the Americas on is what is known as the Middle Passage. It was a very, very brutal journey of about 3 months, and a lot of people died on it. The third part is where English ships would travel, taking the raw materials from America to Europe so that those could be turned in turn into the manufactured goods or the finished products, and then it would start all over again. A lot of times it didn't always go straight to Africa, though. They would sell it to each other in Europe, and they would also take it back to the Americans and sell it to them as well. So these are the three steps on that triangular trade. Now, When they wanted cheap labor before slaves, how did they get it? Well, they got it in a system known as the indentured servant system. So what they would do is they would basically buy the journey for these people who wanted to live in America, wanted to get a new start. Somebody would pay their way to America. Well, when they got to America, they would work that debt off, and it could be anywhere from 4 to 7 years. So they're called indentured servants. Well, the problem is, after 4 to 7 years, what happens? Well, they're no longer slaves anymore, and they were basically slaves before. They just didn't get paid, but for a temporary amount of time. So you can think of an indentured slave or indentured servant as a temporary sort of slave. They're just working a debt off. Well, that makes for some very cheap labor while you have one of those people, but when it's over, it's over. You have to find some other source of labor. So after a period of time, all the indentured servants had worked off their debt, and they were gone. So that's when they discovered this chattel slave system of the African slaves. So after a while, the indentured servants worked off their debt, but the landowners still needed cheap labor. So in 1619, African slaves were introduced as a new source of labor, and they never work off a debt. They unfortunately have to work for life, which is what a slave is. Now this is what we mean by triangular trade. If you look at this map of that went too fast. If you look at this map of North America, South America, the West Indies or the Caribbean is the same thing. Europe up here, Africa down here, and this is the Atlantic Ocean. You can see how it sort of makes a triangle right here. A very easy to see triangle. I was going to see if I could draw on this for you real quick. So you can see in the steps that were described to you before, the first leg is up here in England, or the mother country. And England is what makes the stuff. The stuff, that is the finished goods or the manufactured goods, those things can be sold to other Europeans, so throughout Europe. They can also be sold back to the Americans at high profits, and they can be taken on this leg of the trip down to Africa where they'll be traded for slaves. Okay, so that's that first part. This is the finished goods or the manufactured goods or finished products. So after they're traded for the slaves are brought to America, to the West Indies, to America, to even Brazil and South America, and they're forced to do this hard labor. This trip right here is called the Middle Passage. You need to know that. You'll have quite a few questions about that on your test. And then the final leg of the trip is where the slaves have worked. They've worked very hard. They've produced the raw materials, the cotton, that sort of thing that goes into the shirts, and those things are brought back to Europe. And then Europe manufactures that in their factories and that sort of thing. And then it starts all over again. And you can see it makes this triangle shape, even though it's kind of twisted. This is the transatlantic slave trade system. This is the triangular trade system. This is both of those. They mean the same thing. So I want you to see that and understand that those mean the same thing, okay? Now, unfortunately, this is a difficult picture to look at, but you can see this is taking place in Africa. Some African peoples actually enslaved each other and would trade each other, or trade the peoples they had taken over down at the slave coast, what's called the slave coast. And some Europeans did go in and capture some Africans as well. And it didn't matter how they got there. They were put into slavery for work purposes against their will, brought to the Americas and forced to do hard labor. But this is one of those older pictures that's difficult to look at, but it's true. Okay, this is another picture here. You may have seen it in your Georgia history book. Lots of African slaves being packed into the bottom of these, they called them floating hells. They were the slave ships. And this was a plan for how to fit as many into the bottom of a boat as possible. And many of them would die on the trip, and it's a very horrible thing. Now you can see, if you can see this at all, I don't know if the camera picks it up, this is a chart of slaves imported to the Americas between the year after Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, in 1493, between that and when they outlawed the slave trade in 1810. This shows you how those numbers go up. So I know you may not be able to see the actual part of the chart very well, but you can see from 1493 to 1600, which is about, you know, the 1500s, that time period. It's not very much at all. It's about right there, and that's all there is to it. These are in millions. That's not very much at all. But if you look between, in the next 100 years, 1601 to 1700, it shoots all the way up to here, which is about 1.5 million. That's a lot. And then we've got from the next 100 years, 1701 to 1810, shoots up just above 6 million. Now that's a big jump right there from 1.5 million up to 6 million. So what you can see and deduce from that is that slavery was becoming more and more profitable for these people who were using it. All right. Let's see, get past these questions here. Okay. Well, that was it then. So that's your lecture for transatlantic slave trade and also the purposes of colonization, mercantilism. If you don't know those words, you need to make sure you look them up in your reading. Thank you. Have a good day.